So I'd like to welcome everybody to another in our series of financial aid webinars. Our topic for this term is making the most of your federal financial aid. So we want to do our best to assist students not only to meet their financial obligations to the university, but at the same time make sure that you are able to use that federal funding to get from the beginning of your classes all the way to that time that you walk across the stage to get that diploma. We're here to help facilitate and assist with that process. And we feel that the best way to do that is to help educate our students on the amount of funding that is available to them, the way funding works, cover some very important terms that you might hear your financial aid advisor talk about, so that when they do talk about it, you're in the know and you can participate in that conversation and not just be a listener, but be an active participant in controlling your funding for your education. So we're going to start with some frequently used terms. These terms are specifically involved with your enrollment here at Post. Enrollment is extremely important because your enrollment determines how some of your aid is created, how we're able to award you, and what you're even eligible for at times. So the first term we want to look at is what's called an academic year. I don't want to read these definitions to you guys, so we'll breeze over them, and you can always go back and reread them. But an academic year, or an AY, is the 32-week award that we create for students. This is not to say that it's only one 32-week award during the span of a normal year. We can create one of these 32-week awards right after the other to make sure that you have funding, because we do run 6 terms a year, and we'll get to what a term is in a little bit. The key thing to take away from an academic year is they are split up. Each academic year is comprised of 4 terms. Those 4 terms are split into what are called parent terms. So what is a term? A term is simple. It's an 8-week class period. For some students, you're taking 2 classes. For other students, you might just be taking 1 class. But either way, you're all still in the same term. And to keep things making sense for everybody and to make it easier for us as well, each term has its own number. Term 1 generally starts in July, and term 6 ends at the end of June. So it's a rolling cycle of term 1 through 6 every year. So in your 32-week academic year, there are what are called parent terms. Some people who have been with the university a while, we used to call them periods of enrollment, or POEs. So you might hear your financial aid advisor talk in those terms. The idea is that 2 terms, 2 8-week terms, are combined to make a parent term. And you might ask, why are we doing that? Why can't we just look at them individually? Well, the Department of Ed, who governs everything that we do, looks at a standard 16-week semester from the campus model. So you go to school in September and the leaves are falling off the trees, and you leave in December and it's snowing and it's Christmas time, holiday season. That's what the Department of Ed sees a traditional education as. So our job and our goal is to fit that model. So 2 8-week terms combined together make a 16-week, or the equivalent of a 16-week semester. And that way we can use the Department of Education's guidelines and regulations to award your financial aid and not have any problems in the future. So now we come to enrollment. We look at enrollment not only in the individual term sense, but we look at it as well from the point of view of these parent terms. The Department of Ed requires students to be a minimum of what's called half-time. And half-time means you're taking, in our case, 1 class per term in each of the 2 terms of a parent term. If you were on a campus setting, you'd have to take at least 2 classes in that 16-week semester. So a full-time student would be taking 2 classes per term, and we'll go through this kind of quick. 4 classes per parent term, 8 classes per academic year, and you can earn a total of 24 credits. A half-time student would be doing half the classwork, would be 1 class per term, and this is very important. This is the minimum enrollment status that a student must maintain in order to be eligible for student loans. So if you do not maintain a half-time status, you will not be eligible for student loans and could possibly run into having a balance to the university. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not ways that we can assist, and you would definitely want to talk to both your financial aid advisor and your academic advisor if you do need to take a term off or do have some issues with a class and maybe not successfully complete it. We generally try and help students arrange their schedules so they can either get back to the halftime status or make other arrangements. And that's a great time to reach out to both your advisors so that they can help with that. And that's what we want to prevent. What we're seeing on screen now is the less than halftime. Any person who is earning less than 6 credits in a parent term is considered less than halftime. While they might possibly be eligible for the federal Pell Grant, they are not going to be eligible for federal student loans, which again could possibly leave a student with a balance. So we always want to help students stay out of that less than halftime status. There are going to be situations where it's unavoidable. Again, that's when you want to work with your academic advisor, your financial aid advisor, and even possibly student accounts if you have to set up a payment plan. If we know, these less than halftime periods, if you know in advance because there's a particular thing happening in your personal life, we can always work that out ahead of time. So the next thing we want to look at are some of the terms that apply to tuitions and fees. And again, let me stress that all these terms, while they seem a bit monotonous, are going to really make sense once we get into looking at actual financial aid awards. So they're really important to understand. So at Post, we're going to look at the average tuition for a student who is in an average class. There are some classes that are a bit less in cost. There are some classes that are also a bit more expensive if you were working on like a grad degree. But the average class cost at Post is $570 per credit hour. So for a 3-credit class, you'd be paying $1,710 for that class. Again, we're using the average for this. Your particular situation might be a little bit different, and that's when you have a discussion with your financial aid advisor. Other fees that students might see crop up on their accounts. For each course, there's an electronic course material or ECM fee. This covers the fees for your books, the online class material. We're going to get into a little more detail on that later, but for students who are attending full-time, we waive that cost per class. The next fee that's associated with an education at Post is what's called the technology fee. We shorten it to tech fee. And this tech fee is $50 per term, so it's not per class, it's only per term. And it covers things like Blackboard and Collaborate, which we're using right now, the access to Microsoft 365, our library, Grammarly, all those electronic software features. That's what this technology fee pays for. So now we're going to get into some more financial aid terms. Students are very interested, and we'll go through all of them, in the different types of funding they have. So the first type of funding is called the Federal Pell Grant. It's also referred to as Pell. This award is done based on a student's financial need. In order to receive the Federal Pell Grant, a student has to complete a FAFSA. And I would assume that most of you guys have already completed a FAFSA if you've already begun classes and are watching this webinar. The amount of your award is determined based on your financial aid advisor and their understanding of your FAFSA, the information that comes back regarding your finances, and this is a very individualized thing. Pell Grant, the most important part of it, doesn't need to be paid back. This is a grant from the Department of Education, so you do not have to pay your federal Pell Grant back. The next portion of most students' aid is what's called a subsidized loan. Again, in the office, we might refer to it as sub. So if you hear us talking about that or see it abbreviated that way, that's what it's referring to. All undergrad students are eligible for the subsidized loan based on the need determined from your FAFSA. We'll get a little bit more into that need in a later slide. This loan, the Department of Education is going to pay interest for you when you're in school, at any point that you return to school, which would be called a deferment, and also the 6-month grace period after you've completed classes. They will, at that time, cover your interest. However, I will strongly caution students that if you take a break for 6 months from your classes, that grace period gets used up. You get 1 6-month grace period. So if you've already used that grace period, the next time you stop taking classes, you will be almost immediately expected to be paying your loans back. There are other programs where students can ask for forbearance. If you view one of our previous webinars, Darren covered a bit of that. And if you ever have questions about it, again, call your financial aid advisor. We do have somebody that specializes in this that they'd be happy to transfer you over to. We also have unsubsidized loans. Again, also available to undergraduate students. These don't have anything to do with your financial need. So all students are eligible for these. They're based on the cost of attendance and how much other funding that you might possibly receive. The interest on these loans does begin to accrue the day that they are dispersed. So it is very important to understand that the Department of Ed does not cover the interest on these loans. And then the same also applies when you're in a deferment or a forbearance situation. You're still going to be earning the interest on those loans, which will get added to the principal. So we talked about the cost of attendance as being something that's factored in when we're looking at how much Pell Grant, how much subsidized and unsubsidized loans to give a student. So this helps a student plan the funding of their education. We report it to the Department of Education as a university. It's available to the student upon request. And it's dependent on your enrollment. So we talked about that enrollment. Why? Why is the cost of attendance part of your enrollment, or based on your enrollment? Well, for a student taking 2 classes, they're going to be charged twice the tuition fees. So their cost of attendance is going to be twice as high. So that's the tricky thing. Your cost of attendance is kind of a moving target if you change your enrollment. So in this next sentence, this next bullet point, your cost of attendance minus called the EFC determines a student's financial need. That EFC is another term we're going to define in a little bit. So if we can move on, how do we get that EFC? Well, that's the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, also called the FAFSA, is the form that the student, you, fill out and submit to the Department of Ed. They process it and then send it to the schools that you put a school code on. That federal school code is kind of like an address on an envelope. It tells the Department of Ed what schools you're interested in attending, and it'll send your FAFSA to those schools. So we're going to keep going on terms. So the expected family contribution. We used that before when we were talking about the cost of attendance. But the expected family contribution is a number that the Department of Ed determines from your FAFSA information that says how strong your family is financially. This is not how much you're going to be expected to pay to go to school. This is not how much your award is going to be. This is strictly an amount in dollars that we're going to use as financial aid advisors to determine what types and how much aid you get. Okay, so this EFC is important, and this is why it's very important that students be accurate when they're completing a FAFSA. There's a lot of calculations that go into it. Your geographical location, the number of dependents you have, your savings. There's a number of factors that go into it, and that's why we let the Department of Ed calculate it, because it is a very, very complex calculation. So the FAFSA, when it comes back, gives us another piece of the puzzle when creating your award. It tells us whether or not you're a dependent student or an independent student. To be an independent student is a little bit harder than to be a dependent student. So what I'd like to do is kind of skip over dependent and let's look at what an independent student is. So to be considered an independent student, if you were working on a graduate degree, a master's degree or a doctorate, then no matter how old you are or what your family situation is, you would be independent. If you are under the age of 24 and have a child or a legal dependent as awarded to you by the court that you can prove has been made your dependent, and that child or dependent you support more than 50% of their financial needs, the Department of Ed says you're an independent student. If you're married, if you're a veteran, if you're on active duty with the military, those are all other situations that would make you an independent student. At any time since you turned 13, if your parents passed away, or if you were placed in foster care, if you were emancipated, if you were in court, those are all other reasons. Again, these are determinations by the Department of Ed. However, in some situations, like deceased parents, foster care, or if you were at risk of homelessness, we do need to document this in order to meet their requirements. So your financial aid advisor might reach out for some information regarding that. So other things that go into financial aid, and these will all make sense in a little bit, is what's called a loan origination fee. Every federal loan servicer charges a fee in order to disperse your student loans to the university. And this will make sense when we get to some of the further slides. I might also explain some questions for you guys. So what's a federal loan servicer? Because I just used that word. They are pre-approved lenders that the department uses to maintain student loans. The Department of Education is a government entity, and they don't have the manpower to handle your student loans. While they may be responsible for them in the end, they subcontract the work out to federal loan servicers who calculate your interest, understand what your balance is, facilitate your payback when that time comes. So your federal loan servicer is definitely an important part of this puzzle. So a FAFSA year. This creates a lot of confusion for students. So I'm going to go over this very small entry very slowly. The FAFSA, when you complete it, covers two halves of two different calendar years. So the 2019-2020 FAFSA that we're using right now began on July 1st, even though you could have completed it in December of 2018, and it ends in June of 2020. So the Department of Ed gives students a very long opportunity to begin to do that FAFSA so that they can collect any of the documentation they need. And where we get into the confusion again is that 2019-2020 FAFSA covers the end half of 2019 and the beginning half of 2020. Already available, just so that everyone knows, the 2020-2021 FAFSA has been available since late October. So I do recommend everybody complete that if they can. That way, again, if you get selected for any type of verification process, or if we need to look at your dependency status, we've got plenty of time to do that before we're going to need that to create your financial aid award. So now that we've talked about all the terms that go into the financial aid, how much money do you get? That's what everybody wants to know, right? How much money is there? So the Department of Ed gives us what are called aggregate loan limits. It's a big fancy term for the most money that you can get. That's just the easiest way to put it. So for an independent student, that amount is $23,000 in the subsidized loans we talked about, and it's $34,500 in the unsubsidized. That's the maximum. That's the breakdown for a total of $57,500. If a student, because of their expected family contribution, was not eligible for subsidized loans, we are allowed to reaward that $23,000 as unsubsidized loans so that the student can max out at the $57,500. But again, the normal breakdown is $23,000 and $34,500. Why is that dependency status important? Well, if we look at the second entry here, dependent students can only borrow up to $31,000. Same $23,000 in subsidized loans, but they're only available an $8,000 amount in the unsubsidized. There are ways that students' funding can be extended for dependent students. If you're a dependent student and you feel that your award is too low or have concerns about it, reach out to your advisor. There's a couple different options that we have for dependent students that might be able to open up a bit more funding for you. Just not the topic of this particular presentation. So the other limit that students have is what's called their Pell LEU, or lifetime eligibility. The Pell Grant, while we award you in dollars and cents, is actually calculated on a percentage. So a student whose expected family contribution is large is only eligible for maybe $3,000 in federal Pell Grant, while another student is eligible for $6,000 in Pell Grant. If they both use that full eligibility during the course of an academic year, they've each used 100%, or one academic year's worth of Pell Grant. Here at Post, because of the way our terms and the way our academic years are broken down, each class is the equivalent of using 1.5%. So again, one student could be using $775 for a class, and another student could only be using $250, and they both used 12.5%. All right, so now let's get into some of the loan information. So for a year dependent undergrad student, they are able to, we're breaking the aggregate loan limits down a little bit here. They're able to borrow $3,500 in subsidized loans and $2,000 in unsubsidized loans. This is a schedule based on what the Department of Ed regulates for us. So at any point that you're still in that 0 to 30 credits, any academic year that falls into that amount, that's what we're going to be able to give you as a dependent student, assuming that you've got a 0 expected family contribution. Again, that number can possibly change if the EFC goes higher. From 31 to 60 credits, you can see an additional $1,000 is given to the students in the subsidized category, but no more unsubsidized loans are available. And then we go to third-year students who have 60 credits or more at the beginning of that academic year, and they get another $1,000 in the subsidized loans, but still are capped out at $7,500. So now, what do independent students get? You can see it's a considerably higher amount, $3,500 and $6,000, for a total of $9,500 for the first year. So that independent student in their first year actually gets more funding than a dependent student who's a senior. When you hit the 31 credit mark up to 60 credits, it's $10,500 broken up as $4,500, $6,000. If you notice, consistent is the subsidized loan eligibility. And then for students over 60 credits, it's $12,500. Again, these numbers will become a bit more important as we get a touch further and start breaking down how your enrollment and how you attend can affect your finance. So the Pell Grant is awarded per class. When you're originally awarded by your advisor, you're going to see a number, generally if your EFC is 0, of $6,195. That boils down to approximately $775 per class. Why do I say approximately? Well, the Department of Ed insists on making the federal Pell Grant an odd number, but our terms are an even number. So when you divide an odd number by an even number, you get an odd number. So some of your classes may be $775 for Pell, and others might be $774. That's just because the Department of Ed doesn't allow us to award 50-cent increments. So we have to alternate to make sure that you get all the funding that you're eligible for. Each year, the Pell Grant is examined by the Department of Ed and by the executive branch of our government. And when they create a budget, oftentimes it's increased. We don't know what the 2020, 2021 Pell Grant's going to look like. The past couple years, they have increased it, but that doesn't guarantee that it'll go up. Again, like we said, $775 for a half-time student or $774. For full-time students, that number looks a little different because they're taking 2 classes. So in taking 2 classes, they're now increased in eligibility, and the math works out at $1,549 or $1,548 per term because you're taking 2 classes. So the government gives you more Pell Grant because it's a per class award. So now that we've got all this baseline knowledge, and I think everybody could probably do my job, we're going to look at what the cost is to attend post and then see how your aid factors into that. So we talked about classes being 570 per credit or 1710 per class. So for a student attending half-time, that's 1,850 per term. If you're attending half-time, doesn't really matter, half-time or full-time. For an associate's degree, you need 60 credits. That 60 credits is going to be 20 terms because it's 20 classes. And your total cost is going to end up being about $37,000. This is, again, assuming a student doesn't fail and have to retake a class or any situations like that happen. So we talked about those 32-week academic years. This is going to take taking half-time classes, 5 32-week academic years, which is about 40 months or 3.3 years. So your associate's degree will take a little bit longer than average if you're going half-time. And I want to stress that our program is designed not only to be accelerated, but to be flexible. So when I talk about the benefits of full-time enrollment, please bear with me. At the end of the presentation, there are options available to maximize your funding for half-time students. So don't get discouraged. I promise there's a light at the end of the tunnel for half-time students. So for full-time students, the cost is obviously doubled for tuition because they're taking 2 classes. The technology fee remains the same because that's per term. The good news here is that your electronic course material fees are waived. So every term you save $180. So your total per term is $34.70. Still the same number of credits necessary, but you're completing your degree in 10 terms. Okay. Your cost is also lower, $34,700. You're only needing 2.5 academic years, 20 months, and a little over a year and a half. So that's the accelerated part of the accelerated degree program. By enrolling full-time, you save $2,300. It might not seem a lot now, but when they start charging interest on it, that $2,300 can increase pretty quick. So now we want to look at the breakdown for half-time enrollment for an associate's degree. And what we've got here is a chart. It's very, very full of data. So I'm going to go through the best I can, as slow as I can. That way you guys can go back and review it when you need to. So the first part of your award is the subsidized loans we've talked about across the top row. Now, we talked about origination fees. If you look at the second row, the award that we've created for you with $3,500 in subsidized loans, you will only as a student receive $3,464. That's because of those origination fees, which at the time of this recording are 1.056%. That, very much like the Pell Grant, is a number that gets adjusted by the Department of Ed. So it might change the amount of your loans by $1 or $2. Again, we look at the subsidized loan and we can see the unsub minus the origination fee. You're losing about $60 to the loan servicer on those. Your Pell Grant for a half-time student is $3,098. So in your first term, you're bringing in a little over $12,000 in aid with a total cost of $7,400, and you'll be seeing about $5,102 in stipends. Now, as you progress to the right, You can see as a student grade progresses, we've got the credits along the bottom, their loans increase, their Pell Grant, because it's not tied to credits, stays the same. Their amount of total aid increases as we go to the right. Their total stipends increase. And I think what we need to take out of this, probably the most important thing is for a total of $64,494 in aid, only $37,000 of that's going to your education. The other $27,494 is being sent back to you in stipends. Folks, this is money that you are borrowing. This is money that you are paying interest on. And while I want to make this presentation as accessible and friendly as possible, it's also my job as an advisor to remind you that you will have to pay interest on those loans. It's very, very important to remember that. So if you were to do your enrollment as full-time, you can see we're only using 2.5 academic years. So that's why the third academic year's loans are a bit lower. You're not completing the academic year, so you don't need to use as much loan funding. And the great news is you're only seeing an excess coming back to you of about $47.94. You're only using $39,494 in aid. So your liability to pay back at the end is so much less. And this is the importance of trying to do a full-time enrollment if at all possible. So just to kind of put it in a little different perspective, you're using it as a half-time student completing an associate's $49,500 towards your aggregate loan limits, which for an independent student is only $57,500. And you're using 250% of your Pell. For a full-time student, your loan liability is cut in half. You're still using the same amount of Pell Grant, but that borrowing that you're doing is considerably less, which leaves you less to pay back or more money to use forward to continue and complete your bachelor's degree. So let's look at a bachelor's degree. Half-time enrollment is going to be the same. The only really major changes are the number of credits and how long it's going to take. So it's going to be 10 academic years, 80 months, a little over 6.5 years to complete. For a full-time student, again, those ECM fees are waived. The cost is less. The timing is less. 5 academic years, 40 months, just over 3 years. So if you do the full-time enrollment, you can actually complete your bachelor's degree quicker than if you were in a main campus setting, thus the accelerated degree program. Again, half-time students, I promise you there's options at the end. So you save about $4,600 by attending full-time with those waived ECM fees. So what does half-time enrollment look like? Well, half-time enrollment doesn't quite fit on one screen for a bachelor's degree, so we got 2 slides. As you can see, across the top, those loans amounts increase. But as you get to academic year 6, they go down. Your subsidized and unsubsidized loans go down. And you might ask why. This student who's used the least amount of funding they can per academic year based on their credits and hasn't used the grade progressed aid using the basic structure, they've run out of loans. They have reached a point where they've taken so much out in loans, they've run out. The really concerning thing for students at this point is when we go on to slide 2, I had to replace stipend with out-of-pocket cost. And if you look, academic years 7, 8, 9, and 10, those last 4 academic years, you have no loans. You're only eligible for the Pell Grant, which leaves you out of pocket per term at least $4,302, which leaves you an overall out of pocket expense to post of a little over $17,000. So again, half-time students, I promise there's light at the end of the tunnel. So let's look at a full-time student real quick. A full-time student, because they can get things done in a little bit less time, is not going to reach their aggregate limits. They're going to use the same amount of Pell, but if you look at the breakdown, They do hit that 12,005 at the end for the amount of funding they're bringing in, but their stipends are considerably less. And a full-time student has no out-of-pocket cost because they're using more money from their award to cover the cost of their education. If you look, their stipends over the course of an entire academic year are considerably less when you look across that row on the bottom. So how does this break down in that other format we used? So that student who goes half-time is going to use $57,500 in their loan funding, their maximum eligibility. They're also going to use 5% of their Pell grant, and their out-of-pocket expense, like we discussed, was a little over $17,000. On the other hand, a full-time student is only using $54,500 and the same 500% in Pell. So, oops, I didn't mean to go that far, but that's okay. So it's important to try and maintain that full-time status if possible. Again, you get the ECM fees waived. More of your aid goes to paying for your classes. The stipend that you get are less, so your balance with the federal loan servicer is also not as high. So I promised all along, what are the options here? Students who need half-time, there are options. We're required by the Department of Ed to give you the maximum amount of loans. That does not mean that you have to take them. So I recommend talking to your financial aid advisor. Work with them to lower your loan funding. We can lower it with your written request and make it so that you have just enough aid to cover the cost of your classes. This way, you can extend that funding further. You won't get the benefit of the waived electronic course material fees, but you'll have enough funding to complete your education. By lowering those loans at the beginning, we can save you from that $17,000 out of pocket, because that's what we don't want. Our job here is to help you get to your education and spend as little as possible. We want to get you there, so again, you can walk across that stage and get your diploma with the least amount to pay back in the end. We don't want you to have out-of-pocket expenses. We want to reduce the amount that you borrow so you don't accrue as much interest, because we're about making it personal and doing what's best for our students. So again, I think at this point, I'd love to sum up and say that I want to thank everyone for being here with our presentation today. I want to advise you to call your financial aid advisor, talk to them, ask them about lowering your loan funding, because we're here to help you. We'll work through your budget with you. We'll make sure that we're making the right decisions, that you're making the right decisions to ensure that not only do you have enough aid to complete your education, but at the same time, also reduce that amount that you have to pay back in the end, because that's the tough part. Again, reach out to your academic advisors, reach out to your financial aid advisors. If you have questions regarding repayment, get either one on the phone, and we can get you over to our folks that specialize in the repayment. Because again, and I always like to end with this, we are here, we are at your service to help you facilitate your education and do what you need to get to that end goal. Because that's why we're all here, and that's why we started with education. And I want to, again, thank everybody for being here, and look forward to the next term and the next webinar.